Hillchas Mechir, Chapter 22:1. A person cannot transfer ownership over an article that has not yet come into existence. This applies with regard to a sale, with regard to a present, or with regard to the disposition of an oral will. What is implied? If a person states, "What my field will produce is sold to you, what this tree will grow is given to you, give so and so the offspring of this animal bears," the recipient does not acquire anything. Similar principles apply in analogous situations too. When a person sells the fruit of a date palm to a colleague, he may retract even after the fruits of the date palm have already come into existence. If the purchaser harvests the fruit, they are not expropriated from him. If either of them retract, he is not required to receive the duration mishapara. 3. However, when a person sells produce at market price, although the seller was not in possession of the type of produce, the seller is obligated to purchase the amount of produce he pledged and give it to the purchaser. If he retracts, he must receive the duration mishapara. 4. The following was applied when a person sells produce at the market price, promising to give for a seller, even if the grain was in stock. The transaction is completed. If he retracts, the seller is liable to receive mishapara, provided either of the following stipulations are met: A, the seller shows the purchaser that he possesses grain in the storehouse, or B, the purchaser tells the seller in the marketplace, "I'm relying on you." If the purchaser did not tell the seller, "I'm relying on you," the seller does not consider this to be a firm agreement, and he is not required to receive mishapara if he retracts. For he says to himself, perhaps the purchaser also made such an agreement with another individual, he does not actually require this wheat. 5. An entity that is not in possession of the seller cannot be acquired. It is like an entity that does not come into existence. What is applied when the seller says, "What I inherit from my father is sold to you. What my net will bring up from the sea is sold to you. When I purchased this field, it is sold to you." The purchaser does not acquire anything. Similar principles apply in analogous situations. 6. When the person was on his deathbed and the heir desired to sell some of the dying person's property to spend the money for the sake of the burial, our sages ordain that if the heir says, "What I will inherit from my father today is sold to you," the sale is binding. The rationale is, since the son is poor, if he is forced to wait until his father dies to sell the property, the corpse will remain unburied and be disgraced. Similarly, provisions were made for a poor fisherman who has nothing to eat. If he says, "What my net will bring it today from the sea is sold to you," the sale is binding. This was ordained to provide for his livelihood. 7. If a son sold property belonging to his father during his father's lifetime, but the son died in his father's lifetime, the son's son may expropriate the property from the purchaser. The rationale is that his father sold something that has not yet entered his domain. Thus, the property remained in the domain of the grandfather, and the grandson inherited the estate of the grandfather. Similar principles apply in analogous situations. 8. The following was applied when a person gives a colleague land or property as a present, and together with it gave him 100 denarim to a kin in agav. If the denarim existed in his domain at the time he gave the present, when the recipient acquired the field, he also acquired the dinar. If, however, the giver does not have a dinar, we do not obligate the giver to give the recipient 100 dinar until the recipient brings proof that the giver possessed the dinarim at the time the recipient acquired the present. The same principles apply to other movable property that a person desires to transfer together with landed property through a kinyan agav. If the movable property is not in the domain of the seller or the giver at the time the recipient acquires the present, he does not acquire it. For a person may not transfer ownership over an article that is not in his domain. 9. When a person has entrusted an object to a colleague for safekeeping, he may transfer ownership of it either through a sale or through a gift. The rationale is that an entrusted object is in the domain of the owner of its owner. We operate under the presumption that the entrusted object continues to exist. If, however, the person to whom the article was entrusted denies receiving it, the owner may not transfer ownership of it. It is as if the article was lost. It is not in his domain. Different rules apply with regard to a loan. Since the loan is given with the intent that it be spent, it cannot be transferred except through a mamish lashtam, a convention that is not based on motivating reason, as we have explained. If the loan was supported by a promissory note, the creditor may transfer ownership of the promissory note with a written authorization and the transfer of the note. 4. There is an entity that can be transferred through which one can acquire the encumbrance it contains. 10. Just as a person may not transfer ownership of an article that has not yet come to existence, so too he may not transfer ownership of an article to someone who has not come into existence. Even a fetus is considered to be someone who has not yet come into existence. And thus, when a person wishes to endow a fetus with an article, the transaction is not binding. If whoever the fetus is the person's son, that transaction is binding. The rationale is that a person feels great closeness to a son. 11. When, however, a person tells his wife, "I'll give my property to the children that you will bear," the children do not acquire anything, since the woman was not pregnant at the time the present was given. The children have not yet reached the stage which can be said that a person feels closeness for them. 12. When a person desires to transfer ownership of property to an animal, the transfer is not effective at all. If a person attempts to transfer part of his property to an animal or to a person who did not exist, and afterwards told a colleague, "Acquire a share of my property as this animal does or as this fetus does," the colleague does not acquire anything. If he tells him, "You and this animal shall acquire my property," or "You and this fetus," the person acquires half of the property. 13. A person cannot transfer ownership neither through a sale nor through a present over an object unless it has substance. If it has no substance, ownership of it cannot be transferred. 14. What is implied? A person cannot transfer ownership of the fragrance of an apple, the taste of honey, the color of crystal, like. Therefore, when a person desires to transfer ownership of the right to partake of the fruits of this date palm or to dwell in their home, the recipient does not acquire anything. For this transaction to be effective, the owner must transfer the house itself for the sake of dwelling in the tree itself for the purpose of eating its fruit, as will be explained. 15. The laws applying to transactions involving property consecrated to the temple, the poor, and vows are not the same as those involving ordinary people. If a person says, "All the offsprings of my animals of my animal will be consecrated to the temple treasury, will be forbidden to me, it will be given to charity. Although the offspring does not become consecrated because it does not yet exist, the person making the statement is obligated to keep his word. As it states, he must act according to the statements that he utters. 16. Since this is so, if a person on his deathbed says whatever this tree produces shall be given to the poor, or the rent from this house should be given to the poor acquire these objects. 17. The Organim would differ with this principle and hold that the poor acquire only a similar matter to that of an ordinary person. In a similar manner that of an ordinary person. Therefore, they do not acquire anything that does not yet come into existence. I do not accept these principles. My rationale is that a person is not commanded to transfer ownership of his property. He is, however, commanded to fulfill his pledges to charity or to consecrate property, as he is commanded to fulfill other vows, as we have explained in Hilchos Erchen. Hillchos Mechira, chapter 23:1. A person can transfer ownership over a property itself with regard to produce it yields. This applies with regard to a sale, with regard to a present, or with regard to an oral will. This is not considered to be transferring ownership of an entity that has not yet come into existence, for the article itself exists, and the person is transferring ownership over its produce. To what matter be compared to a person who rents a house or a field to a colleague, in which instance he did not transfer ownership over the property in its entirety, but rather merely the right to derive benefit from it. 2. As implied, a person sold or gave away a field with regard to its produce for a limited time, or for the entire lifetime of the seller or the purchaser. Similar was applied when a person who sells or gives away a tree for its fruit, a sheep for its shearings, an animal or maidservant for her offspring, or a servant for his work. In all such instances, the sale or the present is binding. 3. There is an armslav question if a sale is binding when a person sells a servant with regard to his fine, i.e. whether the fine which is imposed if the servant is gored by an ox and killed should be given to the purchaser or not. Therefore, the purchaser does not acquire the money. If he seizes it from the servant's owner, it is not expropriated from him. 4. When a person sells a tree to one person and its fruit to another, when making the first sale, he did not leave over the rights to the fruit. Therefore, the second purchaser does not acquire anything. If, however, the person sells a tree, leaves its fruit to himself, it considers as if he retained its branches, the place where fruit grows, even if he did not explicitly say so. The rationale is when a person obtains property for himself, he acts generously. 5. When a person sells landed property for a specific time, the sale is binding. The purchaser may use the body of the land as he desires and derive benefit from it throughout the duration of the sale. At the end of the specified time period, the property returns to its original owner. 6. What is the difference between a person who sells landed property for a specific time, one transfers ownership with regard to its produce? A person who purchases land with regard to its produce may not change the form of the land. He may not build, nor may he destroy. When, by contrast, a person who purchases land for a specific time he may build and destroy during that specific time. He may act in the same manner as one who purchases the land forever. 7. What is the difference between a person who sells a field with regard to the produce it yields and a person who sells a colleague the produce of a particular field? When a person sells the produce of a particular field, the purchaser has no right to use the field at all. He is forbidden even to enter except take out his produce. The owner of the field, by contrast, may do whatever he desires within. When, by contrast, a person sells the field with regard to the produce he yields, the owner of the field may not enter the field without the consent of the purchaser, and the purchaser may use the field as he desires. 8. What is the difference between a person who purchases a field with regard to the produce he yields and a person who rents a field from a colleague? A person who purchases a field with regard to the produce he yields may plant trees or seeds within it whenever he desires, or leave it fallow. A renter does not have this right, as will be explained with regard to rentals. A renter does not have the right to sublet the property. When he buys the property, may, however, sell the rights he purchased to another person. Now, when a person sells the benefit to be obtained from a dovecote, or the benefit he obtained from a beehive to a colleague, the sale is binding. He is not considered to have sold an entity that does not yet come into existence, for he is not selling the doves that will be born or the honey that will be produced in the beehive. Instead, he is selling the dovecote with regard to the benefit it produces, and the beehive for its honey. The seller can be compared to a person who rents a stream of water to a colleague, in which instance the writer may derive benefit from everything he catches within. Similarly, when a person sells a dovecote with regard to its benefit, it is as if he sells a tree with regard to its fruit. And the laws applying to both of them are like those applying to a person who rents a house. We've explained in Halacha Aleph, such a person may derive all the possible benefits from the property, and similar laws apply in all analogous situations. 10. The owner of the dovecote does not acquire the eggs and the fledglings in the dovecote until they fly. This is a rabbinic decree enacted as to safeguard the prohibition. Do not take the mother with the young. Therefore, if a person wants to transfer the ownership of these eggs or of these fledglings to a colleague, he should wrap on the dovecote so the mothers will fly away, lift himself up from the ground. He should then transfer ownership of the dovecote to a colleague via Kenyan Khalifin, by virtue of the transfer of landed property, or via another means of acquiring movable property. 11. When a person purchases the benefit to be derived from a dovecote from a colleague, he is not entitled to take all the fledglings that will be born from the time of the purchase on. If he did that, the mothers would fly away and he would destroy the dovecote entirely. Instead, he should leave enough of the fledglings that the dovecote will remain populated. 12. How many of the fledglings must he leave? If there were mother dove and female fledglings at the time he sold the benefit from the dovecote, he should leave the first pair of offspring that the mother will bear, so the mothers will be able to establish rapport with the first pair and the female fledglings that were with them at the time of the sale. He should also leave 2 pairs of fledglings from those of the daughter who were in the dovecote at the time of the sale bear, so the daughters will be able to establish rapport with those 2 pairs, with these 2 pair that they bore. Whatever offspring are born after the first 2 pair from the from the daughters, and the first pair of the mother belong to the purchaser. 13, when the person purchases the benefit begins from beehive from a colleague, he may take 3 swarms of bees, one after the other. After that, he should take a swarm and leave a swarm to populate the beehive. 14, when a person purchases blocks of a beehive from a colleague, he should leave at least 2 blocks in the beehive so the bees do not fly away and abandon the hive. 15, when a person purchases olive trees from a colleague to cut down his lumber, he must leave 2 fistfuls of tree above the ground before cutting. If he purchases a wild fig that was never cut down, he must leave 3 hampers before cutting. If he purchases a wild fig tree that was cut down previously, he must leave 2 handbreadths. For other trees, 1 handbreadth must be left before cutting. For reeds and vines, he must leave the lowest knot above the ground. With regards to palm trees and cedar trees, the purchaser should dig out its roots, for it will not grow again. מכירה, chapter 24, 1. When a person sells 3 trees within his field, even 3 small newly planted trees or 3 growths of 1 tree, the purchaser also acquires the land necessary to nurture them. Even if the trees dry up or are chopped down, he still owns the land necessary to nurture them. The purchaser also acquires all the other trees between them. 2. How much land is necessary to nurture them? The land beneath them, between them, and beyond them, in which a person picking fruit can stand together with his basket. The place in which a person picking fruit can stand together with his basket may not be sown by either the buyer or the seller unless the other agrees. 3. When does the above apply? When the 3 trees that he purchases are positioned like the 3 feet of range on which a pot is placed, i.e. 2 parallel to each other and a third equidistant between them, but not of the line connecting them. There must be at least 4 cubits between each tree and no more than 16 cubits. 4. From where does one measure? From the wide portion of the trunk of the tree. In the following situations, by contrast, the purchaser does not acquire the land. The trees were not standing in such a position. They were closer together than 4 cubits, or more distant than 16 cubits. He purchased one after the other. He sold in 2 trees in the midst of the field, and the third on the boundary line. The purchaser bought 2 trees in one person's field, and 1 in a field belonging to a colleague, or a cistern, or an irrigation ditch, or the public domain was interposed between the purchaser's 3 trees. Therefore, the purchaser does not acquire the trees between the trees he purchased. If his trees dry up or are cut down, he has no further rights. 5. The following rules apply whenever a person purchases 3 trees and therefore acquires land. If the trees grow and a new branch emerges outward from the trunk, it should be cut off so as not to limit the passage of the owner of the field. All the twigs and small branches that emerge from the trees, even those that emerge from the roots, belong to the owner of the trees, for he has acquired land. 6. When a person purchases 2 trees and a field belonging to a colleague, the purchaser does not acquire any land. Therefore, if one of his trees dies or is cut down, he has no further right to the land. If his 2 trees grow and produce twigs and small branches, they should be cut off lest they grow into the earth and appear as the 3rd tree. Then the purchaser will tell the seller, "You sold me 3 trees and I have right to the land." 7. The following rules apply to all the branches that the owner of the trees trims from them. Any branches that grow from the portion of the trunk that sees the sun belong to the owner of the trees. The branches that grow from the roots and do not see the sun belong to the owner of the field. With regard to palm trees, the owner of the tree does not acquire any of the branches, for they do not grow from the trunk. 8. When a person sells land or property but retains the right to the trees, he also retains possession of half of the land, for he does not retain possession of the land. For if he did not retain possession of the land, the purchaser will tell him, "Uproot your trees." Similarly, if he retains the right to 2 trees, he also retains possession of the land appropriate for them. For if he did not retain possession of the land, the purchaser will tell him, "Uproot your trees." 9. When a person sells trees but retains possession of the land, the owner of the trees acquires possession of the land necessary for them, as we have explained. If a person sold the land to one person and the trees to another, and the purchaser of the trees manifested his ownership over the trees, and the purchaser of the land manifested his ownership over the land, the purchaser of the trees acquires the trees and half of the land, while the purchaser of the land acquires only half the land. 10. When brothers divide inheritance, one taking an orchard and one taking a field of grain, the owner of the orchard received 4 cubits in the field of the grain next to the orchard. He is granted the land because we assume that they divided the land with this stipulation in mind. It need not be stated explicitly because it is something that is well known. 11. The following will apply when a person sells a field containing date palms to a colleague and specifies that he is selling him the field with the exception of one specific tree. If it is a valuable and high quality tree, we assume they retain ownership of that one date palm alone, the remainder being belonging to the purchaser. If the date palm that he specified that he was retaining is inferior, we assume that he surely retained ownership over the others, and the purchaser does not acquire any of the date palms at all. 12. The following will apply when a person sells a field to a colleague and tells him that he's selling it to him with the exception of the trees. If it contains only date palms, the seller retains ownership over the date palms. If it contains only vines, the seller retains ownership over the vines. Similar will apply if it contains only one other type of tree. If the field contains vines and date palms, the seller retains ownership over the vines alone. If it contains trees and vines, the seller retains ownership over the trees alone. Similarly, if it contains other trees and date palms, it retains the other trees alone. The rationale is that whoever sells generously. If the seller retains ownership over the date palms, he retains ownership only over only those date palms that are tall and that one must ascend by means of a rope. The others belong to the purchaser. If he retains ownership over the trees, he retains ownership over only those trees that will not be bent over by a yoke. Those that can be bent over by a yoke belong to the purchaser, and they're considered to be part of the field. 13. The following will apply when a person tells a colleague, "I am selling you land and date palms." Even if there are no date palms on the land that he was intending to sell, if he desires to transfer ownership of 2 other date palms, the transaction is binding. The purchaser does not have the option of saying, "I am purchasing only land that has date palms growing on it." If, however, the seller tells him, "I'm selling you land with date palms," sales binding only when there are at least 2 date palms on the land. If not, it's considered a transaction entered into under false premises, and it is nullified. If the seller tells the purchaser, I'm selling you land for date palms, it need not have date palms. This expression indicates that merely the land is fit to grow date palms. 14, when a person sells an orchard to a colleague, he must write, acquire the date palms, the dates, and the palm branches. Although the purchaser acquires all these entities when they are not explicitly mentioned in the deed of sale, mention that makes the wording of the document articulate. Similarly, when a person sells land and property to a colleague, he must write, I have not retained ownership over anything in the sale to prevent judgments and claims from arising. 15, the following is applied when a person sells a house to a colleague, even though he writes in the deed of sale, I have transferred ownership over its depths and its heights. He must write to him, acquire from the ground of the sky's depths to the height of the sky. For the heights and depths of the property are not transferred when no specification is made. If he said he would transfer ownership over the heights and the depth, the purchaser would acquire the height, i.e. the atmosphere alone, and the depth, what is under the ground. He does not acquire what is in the limits. Whenever he writes from the ground of the earth depths to the heights of the sky, he acquires the water receptacle and cistern that are in the midst of the earth and the pathways that are in between the ceiling and top of the building. 16, when a person sells a home on the condition that the upper story remains his, he retains possession of that portion of the building. If he desires to extend protections from it, he has the right. If it falls, he may rebuild it, and if there was the third story built on top of the second and it fell, if he desires to rebuild it, he may build it as it was before it fell. 17, although a person sells his grave, the path to his grave, the place where the funeral procession stands in honor of the departed of the place where eulogies are recited, the family may come and bury the deceased there, or perform any of the other rites against the will of the purchaser. This privilege was granted lest the failure to do so blemish the honor of the family. They must pay the purchaser for the grave in which the deceased was buried. This provision was granted even though it was not stated explicitly in the original deed of sale.